By the late 18th century, the coaching roads of Britain had become essential arteries of movement. They carried merchants, soldiers, lawyers, government dispatches, wealthy families, and ordinary travelers between growing towns and distant counties. Yet even on the most frequently traveled routes, a winter journey remained slow, uncomfortable, and dangerous. On this particular evening, the cold had arrived before sunset. The stagecoach moved north through a narrow country road bordered by hedges stiff with frost. Its wooden wheels struck frozen ruts with enough force to shake every passenger inside. Leather straps suspended the coach body above the wheels, but they offered little protection from the violent motion. With each turn, the carriage leaned, groaned, and threatened to throw its occupants against one another. Outside, the coachman sat high above the road, wrapped in a heavy wool coat. His hat had been pulled low against the wind, and a scarf covered most of his face. In one gloved hand he held the reins. In the other he carried a long whip, not simply to drive the horses forward, but to guide a team already struggling against exhaustion. For horses pulled the coach. Their breath rose in pale clouds, and ice had begun to gather around the metal fittings of their harnesses. Their shoes struck the frozen ground with an uneven rhythm. Inside the coach, 6 passengers sat facing one another in a space barely large enough for 4. Among them was Thomas Hale, a cloth merchant traveling to York to negotiate a delivery of dyed wool. He was 42 years old, practical by temperament, and accustomed to discomfort. Even so, he had spent the last hour pressing his boots against the floorboards in an attempt to keep feeling in his toes. Beside him sat Mrs. Margaret Bell and her 17-year-old daughter Eleanor. They were traveling to stay with relatives after the recent death of Margaret's husband. Their luggage had been tied to the roof, exposed beneath a canvas covering that was already collecting snow. Across from them sat a young army lieutenant named William Grant, whose red coat was mostly hidden beneath a gray traveling cloak. Next to him was an older solicitor who had introduced himself only as Mr. Pritchard. The final passenger, a quiet laborer carrying a small wooden box, had said almost nothing since boarding the coach that morning. Their differences in class were immediately visible. Lieutenant Grant had paid for an inside seat, as had the Bells and the solicitor. Thomas had done the same, though he had complained bitterly about the price. The laborer's presence inside was unusual. He had originally purchased a cheaper seat on the roof, but after the wind intensified, the guard had allowed him to enter when another passenger left the coach at the previous stop. That decision had not pleased Mr. Pritchard. "There are rules for a reason," he said, lifting a handkerchief to his nose as though poverty carried a smell of its own. The laborer lowered his eyes. Thomas glanced at the solicitor. The man would freeze to death up there. "That is not the question." "It seems very much like the question." The lieutenant said nothing. Eleanor watched the exchange closely, while her mother placed a warning hand over hers, silently reminding her not to stare. Travel by stagecoach forced strangers into unnatural intimacy. Rank still mattered, but the road had a way of compressing society into confined spaces. A merchant's shoulder might press against that of an officer. A widow might spend 10 hours facing a stranger whose name she would never know. Complaints, illnesses, arguments, and private griefs became impossible to hide. There was no heating inside the coach. Passengers relied on their own coats, blankets, hot bricks, or metal foot warmers filled with heated charcoal. Those who had prepared well might carry fur-lined gloves or bottles of warm water. Those who had not prepared had only the warmth of the bodies around them. The Bells shared a thick blanket across their knees. Thomas had wrapped an old wool scarf around his boots. Lieutenant Grant kept his hands beneath his cloak. Mr. Pritchard complained each time a gust of air entered through the poorly fitted window. The laborer had no blanket at all. As daylight faded, the road became increasingly difficult to follow. Snow drifted across the tracks left by earlier wagons. The coachman depended on memory, roadside markers, and the faint shape of hedgerows to remain on the route. There were no electric lamps, no reflective signs, and no reliable weather reports. Once darkness covered the countryside, Every mile became a judgment. A stagecoach journey was governed by time. Coaching inns along the route prepared fresh horses according to expected arrivals. Delays affected meals, connections, mail deliveries, and beds. Yet nature had little respect for schedules printed in newspapers or promised at booking offices. The coach slowed. The passengers felt the change immediately. The violent shaking became a heavy dragging motion. The horses were no longer trotting. They were walking. Thomas wiped condensation from the glass and looked outside. Snow passed through the darkness in slanting lines. He could see only the faint outline of the nearest horse and the glow of one coach lamp. "How far to the inn?" Margaret asked. Lieutenant Grant checked his pocket watch, though the object could tell him nothing about distance. "Perhaps 3 miles," he said. "Perhaps," Mr. Pritchard repeated. The lieutenant looked toward the ceiling. "I do not drive the coach, sir." A sudden shout came from above. The coach tilted sharply to the left. Eleanor cried out as her shoulder struck the wooden panel. Thomas reached across to steady her mother. The laborer caught the wooden box before it slipped from his knees. Outside, the coachman pulled the reins and shouted commands to the horses. The guard climbed down from his position at the rear, boots sinking into the snow. One of the wheels had entered a deep rut hidden beneath the fresh fall. For several minutes, nothing moved. The passengers listened to the wind pressing against the coach. The horses stamped and snorted. Harness chains rattled in the dark. Then the door opened. The guard stood outside with snow clinging to his coat. "Gentlemen," he said, "we need weight off the carriage." Mr. Pritchard stared at him. "You expect us to walk?" "I expect the wheel to break if you remain where you are." The men climbed down one by one. The cold outside was far worse than it had seemed from within. Wind crossed the open fields without resistance, driving snow into their faces. Thomas stepped into mud concealed beneath the frozen surface and felt icy water enter one boot. The coachman remained on his seat, controlling the horses while the guard and passengers gathered around the trapped wheel. The laborer placed his wooden box beneath the coach and examined the rut. "We'll not lift it straight out," he said. Mr. Pritchard looked offended by the suggestion that the man might understand the problem better than he did. The laborer continued, "We need stones or branches beneath the wheel. Give it something to climb." Thomas nodded. "There's a hedge behind us." Together Thomas, the lieutenant, the guard, and the laborer pulled branches from the frozen hedge. Their gloves quickly became wet. The wind entered their sleeves. Snow collected on their shoulders. The laborer pushed the branches into the rut and packed them beneath the wheel. When everything was ready, the coachman called to the horses. The team strained forward. The wheel turned once, slipped and sank again. The guard cursed. They tried a second time. Thomas and the lieutenant pushed from behind while the laborer guided the wheel. The horses leaned into their collars, muscles trembling beneath their damp coats. For a moment the coach seemed fixed to the earth. Then the wheel rose. The carriage lurched forward, nearly knocking Thomas to the ground. He caught himself against the side panel and laughed from relief rather than amusement. The guard ordered everyone back inside. By then, the delay had cost them nearly half an hour. When the journey resumed, the mood had changed. Even Mr. Pritchard no longer complained about the laborer sitting inside. The road had demonstrated a truth familiar to experienced travelers. Social rank could determine the price of a seat, but it could not free a wheel from frozen mud. The snow continued. Inside, Eleanor rubbed her mother's hands between her own. "Will the inn still be open?" she asked. "Coaching inns do not close for the night in weather like this," Thomas said. "Not when they are expecting the mail coach." "Will there be rooms?" "That depends on how many others arrived before us." The possibility of reaching an inn did not guarantee comfort. Coaching inns varied greatly. Some were large establishments with private chambers, dining rooms, stables, kitchens, and teams of servants. Others were little more than crowded taverns with a few beds above the common room. Travelers rarely knew exactly what awaited them. A prosperous guest might secure a private room with a fire. A poorer traveler might share a bed with a stranger. Late arrivals might sleep in chairs, on benches, or beside the kitchen hearth. Blankets could be damp. Mattresses might contain straw, feathers, fleas, or all three. Yet compared with the road outside, even the worst inn could appear merciful. An hour later, a faint orange light emerged through the snow. At first, the passengers mistook it for another coach lamp. Then a second light appeared, followed by the dark outline of a long, low building. The coachman raised his whip and called to the horses. The stagecoach passed beneath a wooden sign that swung violently in the wind. Painted upon it was the faded image of a black crown. Below the sign, a lantern burned above a wide gateway leading into the inn yard. Stable boys ran out before the coach had fully stopped. The guard sounded his horn, announcing their arrival. Dogs barked. Horses answered from inside the stables. Somewhere beyond the courtyard, a man shouted for more lanterns. The passengers looked through the windows with relief. The black crown inn appeared alive with warmth. Yellow light glowed behind thick glass panes. Smoke rose from several chimneys. Through one window, Thomas could see people gathered near a large fire. But the yard was already crowded. 2 other coaches stood beneath the shelter. A wagon had been pulled near the stable wall. Servants carried trunks through the snow, while travelers argued beneath the entrance porch. The coach door opened and freezing air rushed inside. "Black Crown," the guard called. "All passengers out." Thomas stepped down and immediately heard a woman near the doorway demanding a room that did not exist. Behind her, an inn servant was explaining that every private chamber had already been taken. For the travelers who had just survived the frozen road, the journey was over for the night. Their struggle for shelter had only begun. The moment the passengers entered the Black Crown Inn, they discovered that warmth and comfort were not the same thing. The main doorway opened directly into a broad passage filled with wet coats, muddy boots, wooden trunks, and impatient voices. Servants moved quickly between arriving travelers, carrying luggage toward staircases or storage rooms. The floor was slick with melted snow, and cold air entered each time the door swung open. From the inn yard came the constant sound of horses, wheels, and shouted instructions. Thomas Hale stepped aside to allow Margaret and Eleanor Bell through the crowd. After hours inside the coach, his legs felt stiff, and the icy water inside his right boot had numbed his toes. Yet he understood immediately that standing near the doorway would accomplish nothing. At a long wooden counter, the innkeeper was surrounded by travelers demanding rooms. He was a broad man in his 50s named Samuel Whitcomb. His dark waistcoat was strained across his stomach, and a ring of keys hung from his belt. He spoke to 3 people at once while watching the servants, the entrance, and the staircase with the alertness of someone who knew that every mistake would cost money. "I reserved a private chamber," Mr. Pritchard declared as he forced his way forward. Whitcomb did not look impressed. "Under what name?" "Pritchard. Edmund Pritchard." The innkeeper opened a ledger and ran one finger down the page. "No private chamber under that name." "That is impossible." "It may be inconvenient," Whitcomb replied, "but it is not impossible. I was promised a room." "You were promised lodging, sir." "Tonight, lodging may mean a bed shared with another gentleman." Mr. Pritchard's face tightened. "I do not share beds." Whitcomb looked past him toward the crowded passage. "Then you may share the floor." In the 18th century, privacy at an inn was never guaranteed. Wealth could improve a traveler's chances, but even money could not create rooms where none existed. During storms, fairs, military movements, or periods of heavy road traffic, every chamber might be occupied long before the final coach arrived. Beds were valuable commercial spaces. An innkeeper could place 2 strangers in one bed, and in poorer establishments, 3 or more travelers might be expected to sleep together. The arrangement was not always considered unusual. It was simply part of travel. Thomas approached the counter after Pritchard stepped away. 2 women, he said, indicating Margaret and Eleanor. They need a safe room. Whitcomb studied them. A widow and her daughter. Margaret answered quietly. Yes. The innkeeper lowered his voice. There is a small chamber beside the housekeeper's room. No fire and the window shutter does not close properly. But it has a door with a lock. That will do, Margaret said immediately. It will cost 2 shillings. Thomas frowned. For a room without a fire. For the last room with a lock. Margaret reached for her purse, but Thomas stopped her. I will pay half. That is not necessary, she said. Neither was pushing the coach, but we all benefited from it. For the first time that night, Margaret smiled. Lieutenant Grant was offered a place in a room with 2 traveling officers. Mr. Pritchard received a shared bed with an elderly physician. The silent laborer was told he could sleep in the stable loft for a penny. Thomas was given no room at all. You may take the bench in the back parlor, Whitcomb told him. Provided no gentleman pays to have the room cleared. And if one does, the kitchen floor. It was a simple arrangement, and a revealing one. The Black Crown did not operate only as a shelter. It was a carefully managed business. Every bed, meal, candle, fire, bucket of hot water, and space near the hearth could be sold. Travelers paid according to what they required and what the innkeeper believed they could afford. The main public room was warmer than the passage, but only near the fireplace. A large fire burned against one wall, surrounded by men holding cups, drying gloves, or warming their backs. Those nearest the flames had claimed their places earlier and showed no intention of surrendering them. Travelers arriving late were forced to remain at the edges of the room, where the cold entered through gaps in the windows and stone walls. The air was thick with smoke, wet wool, spilled ale, roasting meat, and human breath. Eleanor stopped near the entrance. There are so many people, she whispered. The room contained merchants, coach passengers, local farmers, servants, 2 soldiers, and several men who appeared to be traveling salesmen. At one table, a group played cards beneath the light of a smoking candle. At another, a woman fed a small child from a wooden bowl. This mixture of strangers was common in coaching inns. The inn served travelers, but it also functioned as a tavern, meeting place, dining room, mail station, hiring point, and center of local news. Rumors traveled along coaching roads almost as quickly as letters. A man arriving from London might carry political gossip. A merchant from the north might report rising grain prices. A coach guard could describe an overturned carriage, a robbery, or a washed-out bridge. Long before modern newspapers reached every household, inns helped information move between communities. Thomas found a narrow table near the wall. Mrs. Bell and Eleanor joined him, while Lieutenant Grant remained standing. The laborer entered several minutes later, having left his wooden box with the stable master. For the first time Thomas asked his name. James Rook, the man answered. You handled that wheel well. James shrugged. I repair carts. Mr. Pritchard, seated at a nearby table, heard the reply. You should have said so earlier. James looked at him. You did not ask. The lieutenant concealed a smile. A maid arrived carrying a tray of pewter cups. She appeared to be no older than 20, but the exhaustion in her expression made her seem older. Her name was Sarah Wilkes, and she had been awake since before dawn. She had already carried coal, emptied chamber pots, cleaned tables, fetched water, prepared rooms, and served dozens of travelers. Now the storm had brought another coach. Ale, cider, or hot punch? She asked. Tea, Margaret said. Sarah shook her head. No tea unless it is ordered with supper. Why? Because the kitchen is too busy heating separate water. Thomas ordered ale for himself, cider for Eleanor, and hot punch for Margaret. James asked only for water. Sarah stared at him. The pump is frozen. Then nothing. Thomas added another ale to the order. James began to object. Take it, Thomas said. You earned more than ale on that road. Supper arrived nearly an hour later. The meal consisted of thick mutton stew, coarse bread, boiled onions, and a small portion of cheese. The food was hot, heavily salted, and more filling than refined. For travelers who had spent the day in freezing conditions, that mattered more than elegance. Yet not everyone received the same meal. In a private dining chamber, wealthier guests were served roasted fowl, white bread, preserved fruit and wine. Their fire was smaller than the one in the public room, but it belonged only to them. Social class followed travelers indoors. The wealthy purchased privacy, cleaner food, better candles, warmer rooms, and protection from noise. Poorer travelers shared tables, slept near strangers, and accepted whatever the kitchen could provide. Even so, food at an inn could be unreliable. Meat might be old, bread stale, and ale watered. Travelers occasionally accused innkeepers of overcharging, while innkeepers complained that travelers broke furniture, stole blankets, and left without paying. At the Black Crown, Samuel Whitcomb maintained order because he understood both sides of the exchange. When one customer protested that his stew contained too little meat, Whitcomb approached the table personally. "You paid for the common supper," he said. "I paid enough for meat. You paid enough to smell it." The room erupted with laughter, and the complaint ended. Outside, however, no one was laughing. While the travelers ate, stable workers struggled to care for the exhausted horses. The animals that had pulled the coach could not simply be left wet and cold. Their harnesses had to be removed, their bodies rubbed down, their hooves inspected, and their legs checked for injury. Damp horses placed immediately into a freezing stable could become ill. Stable boys carried buckets, hay, and blankets through the snow. The head ostler examined each animal beneath lantern light. One horse had a swollen joint. Another had lost part of a shoe. The coaching system depended on this labor. A stagecoach could cover long distances only because fresh teams were waiting at regular stages. Horses were changed quickly, sometimes in less than 15 minutes. The speed impressed passengers, but it placed enormous pressure on inn staff, coachmen, ostlers, blacksmiths, and the animals themselves. At the Black Crown, the storm had disrupted the routine. Several teams had arrived late. Other horses had not rested long enough. The stable was nearly full. When James Rook went outside to find his sleeping place, he discovered a stable boy attempting to hold a frightened horse. The animal pulled against its rope, eyes wide. "Do not stand in front of it," James said. The boy ignored him. The horse jerked its head, and the rope slipped through the boy's hands. James caught it before the animal could turn into the crowded aisle. The head ostler looked over. "You know horses. I know carts. Horses come with them." Within minutes, James was helping remove damaged harness leather from one of the coach horses. His sleeping place in the loft had not improved, but his usefulness had changed how the stable workers treated him. Inside, Thomas noticed his absence. "Where has Rook gone?" he asked. "To sleep, I imagine," said Pritchard. The lieutenant looked toward the window. "No one sleeps this early in an inn." He was correct. As the evening deepened, the Black Crown grew louder rather than quieter. More local customers entered to hear news of the storm. Card games became arguments. A traveler began singing near the fireplace. Somewhere upstairs, a child cried continuously. The Bells retired to their room, guided by Sarah with a single candle. Their chamber was barely wider than the bed. Frost formed along the inside of the window, and the shutter moved whenever the wind struck it. The mattress sagged in the center, while the blanket smelled faintly of smoke and damp feathers. Eleanor touched the wall. "It is as cold as the coach." "No," Margaret said. The coach was colder. Sarah placed the candle on a small table. "Keep the door locked," she advised. Margaret looked at her. "Is there danger?" Sarah hesitated. "There are strangers everywhere. That is danger enough." Travelers faced theft as well as discomfort. Money, jewelry, clothing, documents, and luggage could disappear during the night. Room locks were often simple. Servants might be honest, careless, or desperate. Other guests could enter the wrong chamber, intentionally or otherwise. Margaret placed a chair beneath the door handle after Sarah left. Downstairs, Thomas returned to the back parlor and examined the bench offered to him. It was short, hard, and positioned beside a window that allowed a thin stream of cold air through the frame. 2 other men already occupied chairs in the room. One was asleep with his mouth open. The other was removing his boots. "You may want to keep yours on," Thomas said. The man glanced at him. "And wake with swollen feet. You may wake without boots." The man considered this, then pulled them back on. Thomas folded his coat beneath his head and stretched across the bench. The sounds of the inn traveled through the walls. Footsteps above, laughter from the public room, dishes from the kitchen, horses in the yard, wind against the shutters. Sleep seemed unlikely. Then the door opened. James stood in the entrance, snow on his shoulders. "The stable master says the weather is worsening," he said. Thomas sat up. "What does that mean?" "It means the road may still be closed by morning." Before Thomas could answer, a horn sounded outside. It was not the departure signal of a coach. It was the warning call of another vehicle approaching through the storm. The inn yard erupted into activity once again. Servants ran for lanterns. The stable doors opened. Samuel Whitcomb shouted orders from the passage. Through the frosted window, Thomas saw lights moving beyond the gateway. Another coach had reached the Black Crown, and it carried more passengers than the crowded inn could possibly shelter. The second coach entered the yard shortly before midnight. Its arrival was less orderly than the first. One lantern had gone out, the left front wheel was damaged, and the horses were covered in frozen foam. The coachman stood unsteadily on the box while the guard called for help. Behind them, 6 passengers waited inside the dark carriage, too cold and exhausted to complain. Samuel Whitcomb reached the doorway before the coach stopped. "How many?" he shouted. 6 inside, 3 above," the guard answered. "1 injured." Whitcomb turned toward the crowded passage. "Clear the long table. Sarah, wake Mrs. Dale. Tell her we need blankets. George, take 2 men to the stable. No one unharnesses those horses until the ostler sees them." The Black Crown had no rooms remaining, but refusing the travelers was impossible. Sending them back onto the road in such weather could have killed them. This was one of the central responsibilities of an 18th-century roadside inn. It was a commercial establishment, but during severe weather, it could become an emergency shelter. The difference between comfort and survival might depend on a fire, a bowl of broth, or a dry corner of the floor. The new passengers entered slowly. Among them was an elderly man supported by his son. His forehead was bleeding where he had struck the side of the coach. A woman carried a sleeping child wrapped inside her cloak. 2 sailors stamped their feet near the doorway, while a young clerk stood trembling so violently that he could not unfasten his coat. The injured man was placed near the kitchen fire. Mr. Pritchard's elderly roommate, the physician, was awakened and brought downstairs. He examined the wound beneath candlelight, cleaned it with water, and tied a strip of linen around the man's head. Medical treatment at an inn was limited. There were no trained emergency teams waiting along the road. Travelers depended on whoever happened to be present: a physician, military officer, midwife, experienced servant, or practical stranger. For serious injuries, survival could depend more on luck than medicine. Thomas Hale surrendered his place on the bench to the woman and child. Lieutenant Grant carried another chair from the dining room. Even Mr. Pritchard gave up a blanket after the physician informed him that the injured man might fall into shock. The crowded inn became quieter as the seriousness of the situation spread through the rooms. Outside, the men worked to save the horses and coach. James Rook joined the stable workers again. The damaged wheel had cracked along one side, and part of the iron rim had come loose. It could not safely continue without repair. Under normal conditions, a local wheelwright might have been summoned in the morning. But the road was blocked, and the nearest craftsman lived several miles away. James inspected the wheel with a lantern. "It can be held temporarily," he said. "Not for a long journey, but enough to move the coach beneath the shelter." The head ostler handed him a hammer. "Show us." James removed a strip of iron from a damaged harness fitting and placed it against the cracked wood. With help from the stable boys, he bound the wheel tightly and reinforced it with nails. Snow blew beneath the roof while they worked. Their fingers stiffened, and every metal tool burned with cold. Inside the stable, the horses required equal attention. The animals from the second coach had been pushed dangerously hard. One had a bleeding mouth where the bit had rubbed its skin. Another stood with its head lowered, too exhausted to eat. The men covered them with coarse blankets and rubbed their legs with straw to restore circulation. To passengers, horses were often part of the machinery of travel. They were exchanged quickly, spoken of in terms of speed, strength, and cost. Yet the entire coaching network depended on their health. A single injured horse could delay a coach. A sick team could disrupt an entire route. During winter, animals faced ice, deep mud, poor visibility, and long hours of heavy labor. The human comfort found inside the inn was purchased partly through the endurance of horses outside it. By 1 in the morning, the public room had been transformed. Tables were pushed against the walls. Straw mattresses were brought from storage and placed across the floor. Travelers slept beside their luggage, using coats as pillows. Those who remained awake spoke quietly or watched the fire. Thomas sat near the hearth with James after he returned from the stable. "You repaired the wheel?" Thomas asked. "Enough to move it. You have been useful everywhere tonight." James held his hands toward the fire. His knuckles were red and split. Useful men still sleep above horses. Thomas looked toward the crowded room. "Tonight most of us will." James gave a tired smile. Across the room, Margaret and Eleanor had come downstairs. Their chamber had become too cold to endure. The broken shutter repeatedly struck the wall, and snow had begun to enter through the window. Margaret carried their blankets. Eleanor held the candle. Samuel Whitcomb saw them and immediately understood. "The room is unusable," Margaret said. Whitcomb nodded. "Take the corner near the kitchen passage. It will be warmer there. And safer. As safe as any place tonight." The question of safety remained complicated. The inn contained dozens of strangers, and many had been drinking for hours. Yet the storm had also created a sense of shared dependence. Those who might ordinarily ignore one another now guarded fires, shared food, moved furniture, and watched over sleeping children. Hardship had not erased social divisions, but it had made them less absolute. Near the fireplace, Lieutenant Grant spoke with one of the sailors about roads along the coast. Mr. Pritchard discussed the damaged coach with James, now addressing him with unexpected respect. Sarah served the last of the hot broth without asking which guests could pay. For a few hours, the Black Crown functioned less like a business and more like a temporary community. But that community was sustained by labor. While passengers rested, servants continued working. Sarah carried bowls from the kitchen, collected empty cups, replaced candles, and helped the housekeeper distribute blankets. She had been awake for nearly 20 hours. Her shoes were wet, and one hand was blistered from carrying hot vessels. In the kitchen, cooks prepared bread and porridge for the morning. Fires required constant feeding. Water had to be melted because the outdoor pump remained frozen. In the yard, stable boys checked the horses repeatedly. The innkeeper reviewed charges by candlelight, recording meals, beds, drinks, damaged property, and horse care in his ledger. The romantic image of the coaching inn often focuses on glowing fires, steaming food, and cheerful travelers. Yet those comforts depended on servants whose work was physically demanding and largely invisible. A traveler might remember the warmth of the room. He rarely remembered the person who carried the coal. Near 3 in the morning the wind changed. The snow no longer struck the windows with the same force. Gradually, the sound diminished until only the crackling fire and the breathing of sleeping travelers filled the room. Thomas woke after a brief sleep and found pale light forming along the edges of the shutters. Morning had arrived. It did not bring immediate departure. The courtyard lay beneath deep snow. Drifts had formed against the gateway, and the road beyond the inn was almost invisible. The first task was determining whether any coach could travel safely. The guard from Thomas's coach climbed onto the road with 2 stable workers. They carried poles to test the depth of the snow. Nearly an hour passed before they returned. "The hill north is blocked," the guard reported. "But men from the village are clearing it." "How long?" asked Pritchard. 2 hours. Perhaps 4. A collective groan moved through the room. Travelers were accustomed to uncertainty. Printed schedules might promise specific arrival times, but winter roads answered to weather, animals, and local labor. A journey planned for 1 day could require 2. Connections might be missed, business delayed, and families left waiting without explanation. There were no telephones to report a delay. Those expecting the passengers would simply have to wonder. Breakfast was served in shifts. The common meal consisted of oat porridge, dark bread, cheese, and small beer. Coffee was available at a higher price, while tea remained expensive enough to be treated as a luxury. Margaret and Eleanor ate beside Thomas and James. Eleanor looked around the room, which now appeared less threatening in daylight. Smoke stains darkened the ceiling. The floor was littered with straw, mud, and candle wax. Men slept awkwardly against walls. A servant carried a chamber pot toward the back stairs. "It looked grand from the road," she said. "Most shelters do when you are freezing," Thomas replied. Margaret folded her hands around a warm cup. "Still, we would not have survived the road much longer." That was the essential truth of the coaching inn. It could be crowded, dirty, expensive, and uncomfortable. Guests might share beds, eat questionable food, endure noise, and guard their belongings through the night. Yet the inn provided what the road could not: light, fire, food, human assistance, and a barrier against the weather. By late morning, villagers began clearing the road. They arrived with shovels, carts, and teams of sturdy horses. Some were paid by the innkeeper, others by the coach company. Snow was pushed aside, branches removed, and frozen ruts filled with gravel and straw. The damaged coach would remain at the Black Crown until its wheel could be properly repaired. Its passengers were divided between other vehicles according to available space and destination. This created new arguments. Mr. Pritchard insisted that his original fare entitled him to an inside seat. A sailor argued that he had spent the night on the floor and would not spend the day on the roof. The young clerk offered extra money for any protected place. Samuel Whitcomb settled the dispute with practical authority. "Women, children, and the injured ride inside first," he said. "Then those who purchased inside tickets. Everyone else takes what remains." No one was entirely satisfied, which usually meant the arrangement was fair enough. Thomas's coach received 2 additional passengers. The vehicle would be more crowded than before, but no one wished to remain another night. Fresh horses were brought from the stable. Their coats had been brushed, their harnesses checked, and their shoes inspected. Steam rose from their bodies as they stood in the cold yard. James Rook prepared to climb onto the roof. Lieutenant Grant stopped him. "There is space inside." Mr. Pritchard looked toward the coach door but did not object. James hesitated. "I paid for the roof." "You repaired 1 coach and helped save 2 teams," Thomas said. "Consider the difference settled." James entered the carriage. It was a small change but a meaningful one. The night had not transformed 18th-century society. A laborer would remain a laborer, an officer would retain his rank, and wealth would still purchase comfort at the next inn. Yet shared danger had altered how these particular travelers saw one another. The road had revealed skills that clothing and manners concealed. Shortly before noon, the guard raised his horn. Servants tightened the last straps around the luggage. Passengers settled into their seats. Stable workers opened the gateway. Samuel Whitcomb stood beneath the inn sign, watching the preparations. Behind him, Sarah carried another armful of dishes toward the kitchen. The public room already required cleaning before the next arrival. The Black Crown would not rest simply because one group departed. Another coach would come. More horses would need food. More travelers would demand rooms. Another will might break, another argument begin, another storm close the road. The coach moved forward. Its wheels passed slowly through the cleared snow and turned toward the northern hill. Eleanor looked back through the window. The inn grew smaller behind them. Its chimneys still released dark smoke into the pale winter sky. From a distance, it once again appeared peaceful and welcoming. But those who had spent the night inside now understood what the building truly represented. It was not merely a picturesque stop along an old road. It was a machine of travel powered by human labor, animal endurance, commercial negotiation, and constant improvisation. It brought strangers together because the journey left them no alternative. It offered shelter but not luxury, safety but not certainty. For travelers in the 18th century, a winter night at a coaching inn could be noisy, cold, crowded, and deeply uncomfortable. It could also save their lives. As the stagecoach climbed the frozen road, the passengers wrapped themselves in blankets and prepared for another difficult day of travel. Behind them, the Black Crown waited for the next horn in the storm.